Welcome back. In this video, we'll be covering the second learning objective in Chapter 3, Social Cognition. And in this, the second learning objective involves talking about various types of automatic thinking that we use on a regular basis. One of these types of automatic thinking is something called automatic goal pursuit. And when we're thinking about goals, it's easy for us to conceptualize what a goal is. Like, there's something I want to do. I am going to take these steps to achieve that goal. Goals can sometimes be very straightforward, like I have a homework assignment I need to get it done, or I have to record these videos, got to get that done. There are other kinds of goals. Some of them are super simple, some are more complex. When you have competing goals in your life, that's when you have to make choices. So, for example, right now, I have to record these videos. I also need to do laundry and probably should walk my dogs. Those are competing goals. It's a very common experience for people to have. What we choose can be based on priming and accessibility. What you're going to do, if you have these competing goals, if something is primed, like if you see someone else doing something similar, it may prime you to move in the direction of a similar goal. If something has been made very accessible in mind, it may trigger you to pursue the goal that's associated with that memory being triggered. So our goals that we're going to pursue at any given moment can be unconsciously activated by what's going on around us. So one example that they give you in your textbook is that if we, in a research situation, prime people with religious thoughts, like, nuggets from the Ten Commandments, for example, that has been shown, experimentally to increase goal pursuit associated with kindness. So, what they may do in this kind of manipulation in a laboratory study is to, give some of the participants a religious prime, give other participants a non-religious prime, something to think about before the task. Then the task may be a game-playing situation where you can actually be charitable and cooperative, or you can be competitive and kind of cutthroat. So you have a choice of strategies to use as you pursue the goals in the game. When people are primed with religious thoughts, they tend to choose cooperation and collaboration more often than being competitive and cutthroat. If they're not primed with religious thoughts, they tend to be pretty balanced in terms of which they're going to choose. So this kind of priming can shift what motivates you in terms of your choices during goal pursuit. Another aspect of automatic thinking has to do with how we think about our bodies and how we think about our mental processes as well. In some situations, especially when situations are highly ambiguous and they don't immediately offer us solutions, we often will use the most accessible schemas that are available to us to make choices. If you're tired or you're a little sick, a little weary, the dominant schema is going to be kind of clouded by those experiences. So if you're tired or sick and you have to be in a social situation anyway, like I've had to walk into the classroom exhausted more times than I can count, and it tends to activate schematic expectations of negative workplace experiences. So I may expect that my day, simply because I'm tired, I may have more accessible thoughts about a bad work day. So it may lead me to see the world much more negatively as a result. There are also ways in which metaphors that, and another example of this could be meme thinking, where you use a visual or graphic metaphor that you hold in mind. Those can also trigger certain kinds of schemas. So, for example, when people are primed with metaphors about cleanliness being associated with being a good person, it can influence the decisions that we make later. So if we prime someone with this, cleanliness is associated with being good and moral, and we expose them then to images of people who aren't quite clean, people will be more judgmental toward those people when they've been primed with the metaphor. If we don't prime them with that metaphor, they're less judgmental and hostile towards people who seem to break the norm. Another example that they give you in your textbook is one that students simply don't believe, but it's been replicated and found to be an effect that's fairly reliable. If you hand someone a warm drink and then they meet a new person, someone that they don't know, they will tend to see the person as more warm when they're engaging in friendly behavior. So they'll often adopt the motif that the hot drink represents. If they're holding a hot drink and someone appears to be unfriendly, they may see that person as cold. So the hot drink, it kind of becomes a metaphor where you're going to use words like warm or cold to describe the person. If that drink is not there and it is not hot and you're not feeling that warmth through the cup, that metaphor isn't activated. So just the fact that warmth is touching your skin, I would guess that if we wrapped people in a warm blanket, it would have the same kind of impact, because it would be triggering this metaphoric representation of warm versus cold as a dimension on which people's personalities vary. Physical sensations like these, like smelling something clean, smelling or holding a hot beverage, holding something heavy, can create a situation where you have schematic representations that are metaphors that can then become shortcuts for making decisions about topics, about people, whatever. It makes this example also often makes me think, how much of my day am I literally holding a cup of coffee all the time? And I'm wondering, is that making more accessible this warm versus cold kind of judgment that I might be making? Well, if you go by the research evidence, it certainly can. Now, this video is, well, I'll let it speak for itself, but it really helps to explain how we use schematic representations, and it'll introduce us to the next section in this part of the chapter where we talk about mental strategies and shortcuts.
If you want to know how your mind works and the kinds of things that it does right and wrong, here is an example. Julie is a graduating senior in college. And I'll tell you one fact about Julie. She read fluently when she was 4. What is her GPA? And the interesting thing is that just about everybody will report that the GPA came to mind. Furthermore, we have a pretty good idea of what the GPA is. It's more than 3.2 and it's less than 3.9. It probably is around 3.7. So how did that number come to your mind? We know that. And it came to your mind in the following way. When you heard that Julie read fluently at age 4, that gave you an impression of how precocious and intelligent intelligent she is. You could say you know in what percentile she is on the distribution of intelligence. And what you did to get a GPA is very simple. You matched that percentile. So you gave her the same percentile of GPA that you had given her on the evidence. Now, that is such a natural way for the mind to work that you may wonder what's wrong with it. Well, a lot is wrong with it. Because basically you know almost nothing about Judy. Just think about the possibilities. She might have been anorexic as an adolescent. She might have fallen with a bad crowd. She might have broken up very painfully with her boyfriend. Lots of things could have happened that would have prevented her from achieving a high GPA at the university. You don't know those things. But your mind didn't stop on what you didn't know. It just made the best use possible of what you do know.
I'm going to pause it there because I want to emphasize the part in the yellow banner. Now, the voice on the video is Danny Kahneman, who in the next section of the chapter, he and Amos Tversky are kind of the fathers of the study of heuristics and judgment, and they very much espouse this cognitivist approach. So essentially what he's arguing here is your mind doesn't stop on what you don't know. It really leans hard on what you do know. So if you're given one nugget of information, like she read fluently at age 4, you need to feel comfortable, like you know what this person is about. You need to build a profile that's bigger. And if you're asked to make a judgment, like, what do you think her GPA is? The range of responses is going to fit with that one factual nugget, even though, if you were forced to pause, and particularly if you're asked to really explore the fact that you don't know much about her, then you may back off of that, but it's going to remain very, very powerful. So even when people are forced to do more thinking about who a person is, they may not get very far, and they typically will not deviate from their initial judgment based on that one fact. Mental strategies and shortcuts are our default position when we're making decisions. Now, there are tremendous individual differences, but day to day, I want you. Here's another challenge for you. You'll find that I have these sort of mini challenges in all of my lectures. Tomorrow, try to keep track of every social decision that you make. You'll get exhausted within a handful of hours because most of our decisions are going to be fairly automatic. They don't require effort because we're using mental strategies and shortcuts. When we use these shortcuts, and social psychologists typically call them heuristics, when we're using shortcuts, we do so because they're efficient and they usually lead to good outcomes for us. Or we just don't know that the outcomes were somehow problematic. We have to make so many judgments and decisions all day long. Just today, I had to make decisions like, what shoes should I put on? What kind of socks should I put on? What kind of shirt should I put on? Should I wear pants or should I wear shorts? That means I have to look at the temperature. Then should I water the plants in the front or the back first? How much water should I give the plants? Do I need to start thinking about, cleaning up some of my garden beds? When should I walk the dogs? Is it too hot to walk the dogs? All of these are decisions that we have to make. Now, think about other social decisions. Like, I'm in the grocery store, and I tend to be a pretty introverted person, I'll admit that. But I'm in the grocery store. Who do I say hello to out loud? Or do I just nod? Is this person someone who's likely to be friendly? Are they not likely to be friendly? Is this someone I want to try and avoid for whatever reason? We make hundreds and hundreds of these little decisions all the time. And most of the time, we don't give them very much thought, and we don't do a thorough investigation of the pros and cons of various reactions. We just don't have time for that. So we use these mental shortcuts to efficiently manage our day. Otherwise, our brains would be on overload all the time, and we wouldn't be able to get anything done. The downside is that mental shortcuts can lead us astray. They are error-prone. So one shortcut that we use that we already know about is using schemas that represent situations to understand new situations. When we make specific judgments, we don't always have a ready-made schema to use, though, and that leads us to needing other kinds of heuristics that can be applied to multiple situations. And these are called heuristics. Now, the study of heuristics emerged not just in psychology, but also in the field of economics, specifically in a sub-area of economics called behavioral economics, which applies kind of the theories and understandings of social psychology to situations where you're estimating risk. As an example, things that can readily be applied to people's judgments and decisions in the marketplace as well. So what is a heuristic? It's basically a mental shortcut that allows us to make quick judgments about all kinds of things. They don't guarantee accuracy, but they're really quick. So, as I was saying previously, if we were to fully interrogate every decision we need to make with elaborate pros and cons and research, we would never get anything done. I had to choose socks today, and I was really all I want is socks that are comfortable and don't slide down my shoes, and I picked them out and put them on. It didn't require any more thought than that. Low stakes decision. Other decisions that we make have somewhat higher stakes, but we still don't give them any more attention. We use heuristics instead. Sometimes heuristics don't do a good job for us. When they're misapplied, they can lead to mistakes where we make the wrong choice and the wrong judgment. One type of heuristic that we use a lot is called the availability heuristic. And this is a shortcut where we base a decision almost exclusively, although we don't know we're doing it this way, but we base it on how easily an example comes to mind. So the classic example of, which is more likely, and then fill in the rest of that sentence. I'm going to show you a video in a little bit about sharks versus horses, so I'm not going to spoil that. But if you ask people, what's the most likely way for people to die, they're usually going to tap into the thing that first comes to mind in terms of common causes of death. And then they're going to use that as their predictor. The tricky part, though, is if they've just been exposed to specific information, like people's estimates of how likely they are to die in a plane crash go dramatically higher if there's recently been a fatal plane crash in the news. Or their estimates of how likely it is that you will see a terrorist attack the estimate of that is going to go way higher if there's just been a news report about that, about a terrorist attack somewhere in the world. So sometimes what's easy to remember is not typical of the whole picture. So here's a concrete example.
Which should we be more afraid of? Sharks or horses? Before we answer that, let's consider two more questions. Which kills more people each year? Car accidents, homicide, and suicide combined, or cancer? And are there more English words that start with the letter R, or that have R as a third letter? When answering questions like these offhand, we tend to think in terms of examples, and assume that the more examples we can remember, the more common a thing is. Unfortunately, we remember some things much more easily than others, so this availability heuristic can lead us to make really bad assessments of risk. Things that are more commonly and vividly shown in the media, like a violent murder, will be a lot easier to remember than things that are far more common in real life, but aren't as dramatic, like a cancer patient dying peacefully at home. Likewise, thinking of things in familiar ways, like alphabetical order, is a lot easier than new ways, like third letter order. But if we actually count the words, this intuition turns out to be wrong. More than twice as many words have R as the third letter than first letter. We can see this same effect happening in public policy. Americans spend 25 times more money fighting terrorism than fighting cancer, even though cancer kills almost 2,000 times as many people. Both policymakers and the public who elect them remember dramatic episodes of terrorism much more readily than boring statistics about cancer, and that's how priorities are set. The only way to avoid this availability bias is to decide based on statistics, not the news. We just can't trust our intuition to realistically calculate risks. So, which causes more deaths, Jaws or My Little Pony? Sorry, sharks, horses are the real killers.
So the core message there is, without actually looking at the data, we often jump to conclusions about the likelihood of events, and in some cases risky events, based on what most easily comes to mind. And that's the essence of the availability heuristic. The representativeness heuristic is a mental shortcut where you're classifying people or experiences based on how similar they are to a prototype or a typical case. And that typical case is going to, be found in a schema. So in the representativeness heuristic, what you're really doing is, based on your schema, what is this person, what group, based on my schemas of different groups of people, which group does the person belong to? And the problem is that we often make these judgments really, really easily. And what we don't know about, though, is something called base rate. So if you're thinking about back to that Kahneman video where he talks about Julie, who was, fully literate at a very young age, what we think about then is a cluster of added attributes that are associated with precocious reading, like being super smart, getting really good grades, being super successful in school, things like that, or even being nerdy, and even making predictions like she probably wears glasses. So what you're doing there is you're taking your typical case of a super smart kid, and you've been given one nugget of information. You're going to assume they have the whole group. What's missing is base rate information. So base rate information about how frequent members of different categories are in the population is something we have a lot of trouble with. And again, what's the antidote? Statistics. Making sure that you understand how common a certain set of attributes really is. There's this old kind of adage in medicine where, diagnostically, especially in, like, say, family medicine, someone comes in with a runny nose and a cough, you don't immediately go to a rare form of cancer. You go to the common cold because it's common. And you're using your schema for what's most likely as a diagnosis to say it's not likely to be a zebra because zebras are just not common here. Instead, it's more likely to be a horse. Just like the common cold is more likely than is a rare kind of lung cancer. Those errors can be problematic, though, whether it's in medicine or in interpersonal relationships. If you are assuming that a person has more unusual traits because they have one unusual trait, the likelihood of you being right is actually pretty low, but it feels like you're right. So make sure that you read some of the other examples that your authors give you in the textbook for both availability and representativeness. So I think those examples will be really helpful to you. In my next video, I'll be covering Learning Objective 3.3, looking at how social cognition varies across cultures.